Transmitter device activated. Coordinates set for Earth 2.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Earth 2 podcast, your weekly exploration of the DC Comics multiverse and the legacy of their Golden Age characters through the Silver and the Bronze Ages of comics. I'm Peter Watson.
And I'm David Steele. Welcome back. Thank you for joining us. This week's episode follows closely on the heels of last week's episode where Dollman met and battled and threw around and lost Dr. 13. In an incredibly thrilling story about the thrills and perils and excitement of letting commercial office space. Thankfully, there's no letting of commercial office space this week. This week we're dealing with a story from issue 34 of The Phantom Stranger, published originally on the 10th of September 1974, a mere 3 days before the second birthday of Matt Everett, the drummer of Menswear, and latterly the drummer of the Montrose Avenue. We are not dealing with the Phantom Stranger story, though. We are dealing with the backup strip, which features Dr. Terrance 13.
Yay.
Isn't that right, Peter?
It most certainly is, David, yes. Now, we talked briefly about this Dr. 13 last week, but I'll give you a bit more details on his history today. He first appeared in Star Spangled Comics issue 122, cover dated November 1951. Now, the title of his story is The Ghost Breaker.
Yeah.
And there's a fantastic panel in which Dr. 13 introduces himself to the reader. And he says, I am Dr. 13. My mission is to explain the seemingly unexplainable. These strange sounds in the night that make mortal men shiver. The wrenching sobs from an empty room. The ghost-like form which moves closer, ever closer to your bed.
To my bed? Good grief. How can it get through the piles of work t-shirts and unwashed boxer shorts? Good grief.
These things, I believe, can be explained. But I must warn you, there are times when the icy fingers of fear clutch your heart, and the supernatural seems natural. Then it is that all your senses are needed, not to trust what you see. Such a time was the night I talked with the dead. And that brings us into his origin story, as it were, where we discover Dr. 13, his entire family have what they refer to as the Curse of 13 on them.
Wow.
Where they are all murdered or executed, usually because of alleged supernatural practices, but it turns out they're not actually using magic. It turns out they're just ahead of their time. For example, one of the 13s was executed at the Salem witch trials for being a witch.
Right.
But basically they were trying to develop a kind of anaesthetic. Okay, so it's like today's science yesterday they're trying to develop.
Right.
There's another one, I think it was, if I remember rightly, in Roman times, who proposed that the Earth and all the planets orbited the sun and was put to death for these outrageous beliefs.
Oh my goodness.
That sort of thing. You know, so it's very much grounded in the debunking aspect.
Okay.
Like a supernatural version of Roy Raymond, television detective.
I see.
Aha.
Interesting. That's fair. That's probably fair. Yeah.
So, as I said last week, I think, he was in Star Spangled Comics and he moved on to House of Mystery, and then he made sporadic appearances through DC Comics, primarily as a backup feature in The Phantom Stranger, which leads us to today's episode.
Yes. That's where I first encountered him. The first few issues of Phantom Stranger Volume 2, which obviously we're reading from issue 34 today, and of course the Phantom Stranger appearance in Showcase prior to that. The first few issues, they're really reprinting a lot of the old stories from Phantom Stranger Volume 1 from the early 50s. Uh-huh. And Dr. 13 sort of rocks up in the framing sequences of these reprints to sort of try and debunk everything that the Phantom Stranger sort of is saying and is up to. And it's interesting, actually, because even in these first couple of appearances, the Phantom Stranger is a sort of debunker of the spooky, rather than the sort of omnipotent, nameless, sort of originless, smartly dressed, mystical guy who's always been on the fringes of the DC universe for quite a long time.
Yeah.
When did you first encounter Dr. 13? Do you remember?
I think it was one of the Phantom Stranger backups. I couldn't tell you which one.
Yeah.
But it definitely was in a Phantom Stranger story, yeah. Mm-hmm. So,
It's interesting because so much of the Phantom Stranger stuff is undoubtedly spooky and sort of mysterious and occulty and all that sort of thing. So it's always interesting reading the Dr. 13 stories as the sort of counterbalance to that.
Yeah.
I always sort of think that Dr. 13 always comes across as really quite driven, preoccupied, determined.
Monomaniacal, like focused, forthright, yeah.
Yeah, he's quite an unlikable character in a lot of the old stories because he has this sort of focus.
Yeah.
It's quite interesting that we're doing one of these stories.
Mm-hmm.
Why are we doing one of these stories, listeners, you're probably asking, given that, obviously he's a Gold Age legacy character of sorts, as we established last week, but there's a very interesting detail in the story we're reading today, which might alarm you and will definitely lead to some interesting conversation. And of course, we should probably say, get this out of the way, apologies to anyone who thought this episode was going to be about Jodie Whittaker, because it's not, unfortunately.
No, although technically it would be Matt Smith. Or maybe not, now that the Sharpie Doctor's a thing. Who knows?
No, don't spoil it. Don't be that guy. You and Kenny are just as bad. For the purposes of this joke, she's the 13th Doctor, and that's the joke.
Okay.
Do not ruin it by your unnecessary
pedantry.
Talking about how many times Tennant regenerated or bringing in Rowan Atkinson or anything. Right, so Peter's now going to tell us about the cover to issue 34 of The Phantom Stranger.
I most certainly shall. It's very dramatic.
It's hella dramatic.
The line of DC Superstars, banner in the corner, still only 20 cents. In the other corner, the Phantom Stranger logo, of course, across the top. Above that, it says, in this issue, Dr. 13, Ghostbreaker.
It's the only cover, I believe, of the Phantom Stranger series that hypes Dr. 13 in such a way, which is pretty cool.
Gasp. Scandalous. It's a hugely, hugely dramatic Jim Aparo cover, folks. We have a ginger-haired man in a leather jacket cowering behind the Phantom Stranger, who is holding him back because there is, bursting through a pair of curtains, a very, very tall man, is it? Is it a cyborg? It's a guy in a tatty brown suit with a yellow shirt, but his skin's peeling off and we can see some sort of cybernetic robot organisms underneath him, and he looks absolutely insane.
Yes, I've always thought of this one as the Robot Two-Face cover.
Yes, very much so.
Because it does look a bit like Two-Face. And it's an interesting one because this cover was used, I believe, on the cover of Volume 2 of Showcase Presents Phantom Stranger, the black and white, much missed black and white reprint DC series. But this scene of Phantom Stranger and Ginger Man in leather jacket cowering from large Two-Face style robot doesn't appear in the story. There's not a robot type thing in it at all. There's some trickery with machinery. I think there's a man who kind of matches the description of the ginger-haired leather jacket guy who gets electrocuted, spoilers. But this robot doesn't appear. I don't remember ever reading a story with this giant robot man's Two-Face type thing going on. So it's not even like it's a Defenders 39 cover. It's a lie. Of course, I say that, I have not gone and checked every single issue of Phantom Stranger just on the off chance that it might be intended for one of the other ones. So listeners, if you're out there and you're a big fan of Jim Aparo and you know everything about Jim Aparo and the Phantom Stranger and you know if there was a story that this cover was prepared for and wasn't used, do write in and tell us. It's unusual because a lot of the time the covers are quite accurate in this series.
Yeah.
They're almost oft times very representative. Some of them are a bit kind of romancy cover type things with the Phantom Stranger silhouette sort of dropped in, like, what's the one? Secrets of Haunted House and Forbidden Mansion of Dark Love or whatever it's called. Yeah. They're kind of similar to those ones. Yeah, it's the first cover I think we've had, probably in the podcast, that's an outright lie. So, tremendous. But yes, as Peter said, at the top there's a banner that reads, in this issue, Dr. 13, and as we've told you 1,000 times already, it's the Dr. 13 story that we're going to read. Listeners, I will quickly tell you before we start that if you own a copy of Showcase Presents The Phantom Stranger Volume 2, then the story we're about to read is reprinted in it, if you have that to hand and want to read along. Right, so, we have a large caption which sets the scene.
Phantom Stranger fans have been clamouring for the return of Dr. 13 ever since he last appeared. Issue 26. Here is a tale of the Ghostbreaker, now happily reunited with his wife, Marie.
Yes, Marie had been in hospital, listeners, that's all you probably really need to know on that. So, a further scene-setting caption.
A cocktail party.
And we can see, it's obviously, this cocktail party is taking place in a large house. There are a number of people ranged around. Dr. 13 is in the centre of the image, looking very much like Gregory Peck in The Omen, with a pair of glasses. To his right, there's an older man with white hair. To his left, there's a thicker-set older gentleman with darker hair. There's a woman in a pink dress and blonde hair who's sat down with a glass. That's Marie 13. Behind Marie, there's a woman in a green dress. I think there's a maid of some sort. And there's another woman looking very, very well dressed in a black cocktail gown. She's a nice fancy necklace. Her hair's all done up. Tremendous. They're having a nice time. It's beautifully lit. Gorgeous. And the man who's hosting the party is in the process of saying, I assure you, Dr. 13, I've seen it myself. Shimmering and transparent, but definitely the shape of a man. The woman in the black cocktail dress says.
And what about all the things that have disappeared and all the things that have been broken?
And Dr. 13, who, now that I think about it, actually looks quite like Michael Caine as well.
He does, yes.
How is Peter going to voice Dr. 13? This is exciting. Dr. 13 pontificates.
Well, I hate to argue with you people at your own party, and especially hate to say that I think you've been having hallucinations, but that's exactly what I think this ghost of yours is. And I firmly believe that you...
He's interrupted because the woman in the green dress, who we think is the maid, screams and says, "They're the ghost! I saw the ghost! It was standing right there in the doorway! It was there for an instant, and then it vanished!" Dr. 13 says sceptically.
Well, there, I think that tends to prove what I've been talking about. She wouldn't have seen a ghost if she hadn't been talking about ghosts. It was simply the power of suggestion.
Marie 13 pipes up with, "No, Terry, I disagree. I was looking at the doorway myself and I saw it too. There was definitely something there, sort of a transparent man. I hate to say it was a ghost, but that's certainly what it looked like."
Huh?
Says Dr. 13, and then he thinks in big close-up.
Marie's a rational woman, especially about things like this. If she says she saw something, then there must have been something there. But there's got to be some logical explanation for what she saw.
With that, we arrive at the top of page 2. Our caption reads,
Ever since the Andersons moved into their new home, they have been haunted. At first, things were mysteriously broken. Objects vanished. Then, a few days later, they saw it. The man-shaped ghost. And, moments ago, as Marie 13 glanced towards the doorway to the dining room...
I wonder if this panel's a flashback, actually, to what was just happening that we didn't see. It seems to be a different angle. But the guests, including Dr. 13 and in the black dress, are looking to the right, and they can see, it looks like an out-of-tune television transmission image of a man, quite frankly.
Yes.
That's what it looks like. He's kind of wobbly, and, it's white. There's the barest glimpse of features in his face, and there's a sort of sense of smoke sort of drifting through in front of him. The woman in the black cocktail dress drops her glass in surprise, saying,
"What?"
And a caption tells us the name of this tale.
And the dog howls through the night.
And the credits for the episode are given.
Script, Steve Skeets. Art, Tony DeZuniga.
Ooh, cool. Marie continues in the next panel. We're obviously returned to the present. It's probably the shortest and quickest flashback we've ever had. Marie is saying, "It was hazy, Terry, and wavering, but I could even make out some of the facial features. It was a man who seemed to be in terrible agony." And once again, Dr. 13 goes, Then we get another caption.
Just then...
Suddenly, there is a loud... Dr. 13 startles and says,
"Good God, what's that?"
And the host of the party, who's sat down, gestures towards him and says, "Oh, that's Max. He's tied right outside." Caption tells us we're continued in the third page following. We pass an amazing advertisement which says how to be a handcuff king, and another one that says build your own monster, and one for throw. One of those big sort of joke type. The Abracadabra magic shop, in fact. X-ray glasses, throw your voice, vampire blood. Tremendous. And then we pass an advertisement for the amazing world of DC Comics.
Reusing one of the pictures of Cary Bates from his appearance in The Flash.
Yes, indeed. And also a little DC subscription ad which lists Action Comics, Superman Family, Superman World's Finest, quite a few other titles. But anyway, back to the story. First panel of page 3 is an exterior shot of the house. We can see poor Max tied up outside his kennel. And from inside, we hear the voice of his master continuing. "That means the ghost was definitely here. Every time the ghost is seen, it's either right before or right after Max starts howling. He must be super sensitive to spirits."
After a while, the howling ceases, and the party continues. There are the usual type of arguments the famed ghostbreaker Dr. 13 gets into. There is pleasant conversation, and there is plenty of food and drink.
Yes, very nice panel we see of Dr. 13 and Marie standing at the window and some of the other guests enjoying themselves. It looks great.
Then suddenly...
We hear a crash and a bam and a sound effect which generally seems to say break. Dr. 13, glass in hand, eyes wide, says,
"Hey, what's going on?"
And the host of the party, Mr. Anderson, replies, "Sounds like things being thrown around. Coming from down in the basement. Come on." They rush towards the basement. When I say they, I mean Mr. Anderson, Mrs. Anderson, and Dr. and Mrs. 13. Mr. Anderson, taking the lead, says, "There's nothing but a lot of scientific apparatus down there. It belonged to the former owner of the house. I haven't a chance to move it out yet." And he points as they've reached the basement, and he says, "Hey, look!" And we can see the weird, jaggedy, irregular white phantom standing on what looks like it looks like part of a boiler system, or
Yeah.
certainly a big sort of heating thing with lots of pipes and stuff. It looks like the sort of thing I've seen in the basement of many a large venue. The ghostly figure is standing with his arms raised, holding the lid or a valve or something in his hand, hurling it around. Mr. Anderson observes and says, "The ghost's been destroying all the equipment and there it is." Dr. 13 says,
"Yes, I can see it too."
In the first panel of page 4, he reaches and picks up what looks like, I'm guessing it must be some kind of instruction book for the equipment.
Yeah.
Picks it up, saying,
"This ought to help prove if he's a ghost or not."
In panel 2, he hurls it towards the spooky figure, saying,
"What? It's passing right through him."
Yeah, that's what we see. The figure seems to ripple as the book hits it. The caption for panel 3 then reads,
Then,
and it looks as though the ghostly figure's just sort of burst. Kind of looks as if you'd thrown a water balloon full of milk at the wall and it's burst open. We might actually try that and see how it looks and stick the results on our YouTube channel. Watch out for that. As the ghost dissipates, Dr. 13 cries,
"He's gone, vanished. And so is that piece of machinery he was holding."
there's a slow dissolve.
there are no further incidents that night, but the next day, overwhelmed by curiosity, Dr. 13 returns to the Anderson home to investigate this so-called ghost.
Dr. 13's got changed. He's not wearing his evening tuxedo anymore. He's wearing a red jumper and a white shirt and blue slacks. He's got a great big medallion round his neck. He looks hecka 70s.
Gasp.
Mr. Anderson has also changed, looks a bit more relaxed. They're sat down in a very cluttered and busy room. We can see an old clock behind them, some pieces of furniture. There's a desk with some piles of paperwork, a jar of ink and a pen. Mr. Anderson is saying, I put most of the former owner's papers up here in the attic, but I can't see how this stuff is going to help you.
Well, I've got to start my investigation somewhere.
Marie is also present. She's got changed too. She's wearing a very nice black double-breasted blazer jacket, and Dr. 13 is perched on the edge of a couch, saying,
One interesting thing George told me is that the former owner one day years ago just mysteriously disappeared, and has never been seen or heard from since then. Here's a photograph of him. Judging from the date on it, it was taken just a year before he vanished.
Yeah, we can see Dr. 13 is holding picture frame. Marie exclaims, Hey, let me see that. She takes it, has a look, saying, Isn't that the face of the ghost?
I don't know. I never did get a very good look at the face of this so-called spirit.
Yes, I'm sure it is. These are the exact same features, but the ghost was some 15 or 20 years older than this. We get a better look at the photograph here. We can just see a man with dark hair and a suit. Listening to what Marie's saying, Dr. 13 looks thoughtful and says,
What? But that doesn't make sense. This picture was taken only about 5 years ago.
He reaches down the next panel to start picking up some more of the paperwork that's casually strewn around the floor as Marie looks thoughtful, and Dr. 13 says,
Still, if you say it looks like him, then you're getting somewhere. We've got something to work on. Looks like I'd better go through all these papers, see if I can find some other clues of some sort.
We get a closer look at some of the papers. In the next panel, we can see what looks like diagrams and notes all over them. Dr. 13 says,
Wow, these are nothing but a bunch of scientific notations. I do have some training in science, but still, it's going to take me nearly a day to make any sense out of all this.
For long hours, there in the attic, he studies, and studies, until finally...
Yes, we see Dr. 13 looking very thoughtful indeed. Lots of paperwork piled up around him. And then running at page 5, he gets a very moody close-up as he exclaims,
Wait, this could be it. Yes, this must be the answer. It's all starting to make some sense now.
We can see that Dr. 13 is holding a particular piece of paper. I wonder what the piece of paper says. We have a slow dissolve, the caption for the first panel on page 6.
A realization, and with it comes the need, the desire to act. A long shot, but Dr. 13 could not live with himself if he didn't try.
Dr. 13 has obviously made his way down from the attic. We see Mr. and Mrs. Anderson. She was the lady in the black dress we've established. Marie standing at the top of a flight of stairs as he descends, as the doctor descends, and Marie says, Terry, what's going on?
I think I found the answer. There's something I must do in the basement immediately.
And we can see he's still clutching some paperwork. In the next panel, we're obviously down in the basement. We can see that Dr. 13 has a screwdriver in his hand, and he seems to be working at some of the equipment that was down in the basement.
All this seems like an impossible task, but I've got to try, and at least I've got his notes to work from.
Just then...
Dr. 13 exclaims,
Huh?
and he turns around and sees, well, the shaky, shivering, white figure of the spook. Still holding on to his screwdriver, Dr. 13 says,
The ghost just standing there in the doorway, and he looks far older than Marie suggested.
Yes, help me! Please, help me!
Says the ghost. But, in the final panel of page 6, Dr. 13 exclaims,
Gone. Vanished again. Got to get back to work. It doesn't look like I've any time to waste.
Yes, we see him again fiddling with his screwdriver. We pass some more brilliant advertisements that Max and Rich will probably highlight at some point in the Weird Warriors podcast. We also pass a full-page advertisement for some DC Comics 100-pagers, including a very issue of Brave and the Bold that we'll be covering next week. I think that's right, isn't it?
That is correct, yes.
And we recorded it last week, I think. And we recorded it last week after the episode is due out 2 weeks from now. But we'll tell you all this next week, and indeed again the week after. Top of page 7, a couple of brilliant panels. Brilliant artwork from Tony of Dr. 13 working away at the equipment just with that one magical screwdriver. But then he's interrupted as Marie's voice can be heard. "Terry, quick, get up here. Something's happened."
"Huh?"
exclaims Dr. 13. I'm going to do a montage tweet of all the times he goes, "huh," and "hmm." It's going to be hilarious. The next panel, we're back upstairs. We can see Marie and Mrs. Anderson, and Mr. Anderson is kneeling down, seemingly attending to a man who's lying on the floor in front of him. The man is sort of not quite fully defined. There's little bursts of yellow light around him as if he seems to be fading in and out. Dr. 13 arrives on the scene exclaiming,
"Oh no, I'm too late. He's slowing down, no longer as indistinct as before, but that's because he's dying."
And the man on the ground says,
Thank you.
"For trying to..." And in the next panel, everyone's sort of rendered almost in a spotlight, black border. The Andersons and the 13s looking down at the poor unfortunate as Dr. 13 says,
"Dead."
Mr. Anderson says, "But I don't get it. Where did this old man come from? What did he have to do with anything? Why couldn't I see him clearly? Why did he look so blurry?" And we get a slow dissolve.
Later.
And we see an ambulance taking its leave from the Anderson establishment, and the Andersons and the 13 standing outside as the ambulance leaves. Dr. 13 is obviously in the process of speaking. He's saying,
"And what I learned was that he'd been doing experiments in increasing one's metabolism, so he could give himself some sort of super speed."
To which Mr. Anderson says, "You mean like the character the Flash in comic books?"
"Yes, exactly,"
replies the doctor.
"And he did give himself super speed, but then he couldn't control it, couldn't slow himself back down. That's why you could only see him very hazily, when he stood still in one spot for what to him was a long time. He was simply moving too fast for the normal human eye. And his molecular structure kept changing so often things would pass through him, or he would pass through them, and that made it impossible for him to do much of anything. The super speed also sped up the aging process, so he was growing old at a fantastic rate. Then toward the end, the aging process really went out of control."
"But," interrupts Mr. Anderson, "why did he smash up all the machinery?"
"Well, I can only guess at that, but after years of trying to save himself, trying to get help and failing because he couldn't control his body, he finally went half mad and destroyed his machinery in a fit of anger."
Gosh. Some time obviously passes. There's a slow dissolve. We see the Andersons standing at the flight of steps leading into their house. Terry and Marie waving up to them. The Andersons waving back. The caption reads,
Dr. 13 and his wife depart.
and we see them in their car as it moves off. In the next panel, Marie saying, "Hey, why was the dog howling like that all the time? You never did answer that."
Well, I guess it was only at the end that the man learned how to slow down his voice so he could communicate with me. Prior to that, he was speaking so quickly and at such a high pitch, it was inaudible to human ears, but the dog heard it.
Final panel of the story. We see Dr. 13's car along an empty country road, full moon looming in the background as we hear Marie saying, "You know, Terry, it's really very sad. Just imagine being trapped in your own private world for years and years." Dr. 13 says,
"But at least now, it's over for him."
and a small caption reads,
End.
Next issue on sale during the second week in November.
Yes. Well, listeners, hopefully you spotted the panel on page 7 that Peter suggested years ago when we started planning this podcast. True story. Years ago, Peter said, "We need to do issue 34 of The Phantom Stranger." And I was like, "Oh, why?" Because someone mentions the Flash and the Dr. 13 story. I was like, "Oh."
Mm-hmm.
So, Peter, it was your idea of the story. Do you want to explain it for everyone?
Yes.
Good.
Because this kind of implies that Dr. 13 exists in a world where the Flash isn't a superhero, he's a character in a comic book.
Yes.
Because otherwise you say, you mean that character, the Flash, from the Justice League?
Yes. And obviously this messes things up a little bit for us because Dr. 13 has interacted regularly with the Phantom Stranger, and the Phantom Stranger has obviously regularly interacted with Batman and has been offered membership of the Justice League of America.
Indeed.
So,
Gasp.
what's your theory then, Mr. Multiverse Historian Watson, then?
Well, I think there's two different versions of this Dr. 13. There's one that operates in a real world situation where he is the proper debunker.
Right.
And everything he says is true. The typical Dr. 13 story is kind of like this. It's some sort of stately home. There's like some haunting, and he basically says, no, actually someone's faking it for this reason, or this is how they're doing it. But I think he's very right and correct in those stories. However, he completely falls apart when he's in a situation where characters actually do have magical abilities.
Yes.
He can't comprehend that because it doesn't fit his mindset.
Yes.
And that kind of ruins that aspect of the character. The character only really works properly if he's always right.
Yeah.
Or if he's the joke character that says, oh, all this can be explained and it's proper magic happening in front of him.
Yes.
It doesn't work if you try and do both.
Yes. I would agree strongly with that, yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting, but that side of him, that irrational need that he has to be the rational, clear, those are the ones that really, the stories when he can't explain what's going on, those are the really interesting ones where he's really struggling to accept the evidence because he's so determined that, that spooky stuff doesn't exist. I love those ones. That's why it's, despite everything that's going on in the Phantom Stranger stories that he appears in, when he can't accept it, you do find yourself laughing at him slightly and also pitying him.
Yeah, definitely.
And at the same time, you do find yourself questioning it and all and sort of going, is it all hallucination even maybe? Or is Dr. 13, has he got something seriously wrong with him?
Well, he's a rational man. He's the scientific detective. And he can only process things as actual science-based facts.
Yeah, it's interesting actually, because the way you sort of put that there, I've been watching quite a few John Pertwee Doctor Who stories recently. Kenny and I recorded an episode last night where we talked about the book Who Killed Kennedy.
Oh, of course, yes.
Because obviously that takes place during the Unit era, the early 70s, with the Third Doctor. And one of the sort of defining characteristics of the Third Doctor, and especially in stories like The Demons, that he's very sceptic about magic.
Yes.
And all this sort of stuff, and says that it doesn't exist and science is always true. And what we're getting right now, obviously, in the current sort of series, the new episodes that are going out just now, is the sense that that's not the case anymore, that magic and spooky stuff can actually happen now in the universe after DT spilled salt everywhere in Wild Blue Yonder. To go off on a very brief tangent, Peter and I are on a very mild sort of level of disagree about that, aren't we?
I disagree.
Yes. I quite enjoyed, recently, for example, I really enjoyed the episode 73 Yards recently, but Pete said didn't.
No.
So, there you go.
It was very modern horror trope, and I don't like modern horror movies, really, and I don't like supernatural stuff in Who. I like scientific explanations for it. Yeah. I love a John Pertwee type explanation.
Yeah.
In fact, Pertwee is ideal for Dr. 13, let's be honest.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. The comparison is really interesting, isn't it? So I think you'd be more Dr. 13 and I'd be more Phantom Stranger, I think, was what we're
Yes,
saying.
there we go. So, I'm quite happy.
Looking forward to our next attempt at a cosplay then, listeners.
We'll both be wearing fantastic medallions, though, got from this story.
Yes, the fantastic medallions, of course, supported the Montrose Avenue at the Leeds cockpit in 1998. It's an interesting one. They mentioned the Flash is really quite interesting because obviously the readers are going to be familiar with the Flash and how his speed works and all that sort of stuff. Yes. So it's quite interesting that they evoke him to use as an explanation. And it's fascinating, as you say, that they don't just say the member of the Justice League. The fact that they actually mention it, that he's fictional, that makes it almost impossible to reconcile Dr. 13 with the guy that's been featuring regularly with the Phantom Stranger. So this obviously clearly is another part of the continuum. The thing is, though, a couple of years hence from this, Dr. 13 would become the cover star, the cover feature of DC's, but then one of the few remaining sort of supernatural books, Ghosts. He gets a cover feature, a few stories, and over a 3-issue arc, he encounters the greatest ghost of them all, the Spectre.
Gasp.
And also, in addition, Earl Crawford from the Adventure Comics Spectre strips, isn't that? So, looking forward to Peter and Steve and I, if we're all still speaking to each other in 2 or 3 years' time, tackling all 3 issues of Ghosts, issues 97, 98, 99, I think it is, in one episode, yes. So, look forward to that. It's an interesting one. I remember you suggesting that we did this story back in 2019 when we started planning. Because when I was making up the master list, but it's much more recent than that. You found the Dollman story we did last week, wasn't it?
Yes, that was only the last year or so, I think.
Amazing.
Yeah. Comic book archaeology, folks, that's what we do.
Yeah, it was great, because obviously it meant straight away that we had more of a reason to do a Dr. 13 story, because, there was evidence, there was another Dr. 13, so he was a Golden Age legacy character. Tremendous.
Indeed.
As I've mentioned, Dr. 13 rocks up in Ghosts. I think I've got at least one issue that he's in, so I might try and put a little other Dr. 13 appearances cover gallery together. Maybe I'll see if I can right-click and find some Star Spangled covers that he was on. like Prez, who we've mentioned, and like Phantom Stranger, and like indeed Tomahawk and Brother Power the Geek, he also got a Vertigo Visions title, all of his own,
So he did.
published in July 1998. So I'm going to stick the cover and some pages from that on the socials this week. And much later, of course, he would be the backup strip in the series that spun out, I think, of one of the whichever, was it Final Crisis and Infinite Crisis, I can't remember. The series Tales of the Unexpected, which headlined the Spectre, who by this point was in the form of Crispus Allen. So we might talk about that one day in the far future, you never know. But Dr. 13 was the backup strip in that, which was a fascinating series, wasn't it?
Yeah, again, he was kind of played as the butt of the joke in that series, which was a bit annoying, but it was all done in good fun because basically it set up these kind of 4 god type characters who were controlling everything. And they were basically Mark Waid, Jeff Johns, Grant Morrison, and Greg Rucka, I believe, if I remember rightly.
Yeah. They were the guys that were sort of running... Were they writing 52 or and all that sort of stuff? Yeah, it's a fun series because quite a lot of other characters pop up in it, like Funky Flashman pops up. Infectious
Lass and Porcupine Pete, yeah.
Yeah, Jeb Stewart from the Haunted Tank.
Of course, yeah.
Genius Jones, iVampire, they all rock up. So we'll try and get some representation of that up on the socials this week as well, listeners, so you can have a look.
You will not be stuck.
Have a look at that as well. We would encourage you actually to track down that series because the Spectre story is quite interesting. The Phantom Stranger features, as does Batman. If you're interested in the history of the Spectre, because obviously we're covering his adventures in Weird Adventure Comics at the moment, you should check that series down because it's very, very interesting. Another version of the Spectre. Yes, gosh, Dr. 13, amazing.
Sadly, there's not much talk in the letters pages about the Dr. 13 story we've discovered, which is a shame.
There's none at all, really, let's be honest.
Well, they mentioned Dr. 13, but not in regards to this story, so...
Yeah, it's a shame. It's a pity. It would have been nice to have some contemporary correspondence.
Yeah.
It would have been nice to have a contemporary reader saying, why did you have Dr. 13 mention the Flash?
Yes. That would have been good.
Well, we'll just have to rely on the listeners to write in with their thoughts on it then, won't we?
Yes, absolutely. And if you'd want to do that, you can email us at theearth2podcast@gmail.com. Make sure you follow us on social media, because as David said there, we'll be putting up lots of lovely bonus material for this, and indeed every episode.
Yes.
On Facebook and Instagram, we're at the Earth2 Podcast, and on Twitter, we're at podcast_Earth2. And it's the number 2 for all our social media.
If you're feeling generous, you know the drill. You can probably recite this alongside me by this point. You go to wherever it is you receive your podcasts and leave us a positive review, or go to our coffee page and buy Peter the price of a beverage as he sits in Cafe Nero at 7 o'clock every morning, editing out all my mistakes. I'm sure Peter would appreciate that.
Absolutely true.
Failing that, just tell your pals. Spread the word.
Indeed.
We were talking to a couple of people actually at the Comic Mart the other week that we were both in attendance of, weren't we?
Yes.
Who we said we would give a shout out to, and we haven't done that yet. So we have to say hello to Alistair and Craig Flood.
Hi guys.
We're waving now.
Thanks for listening.
And I'll say hello to Andy, the audio guy who works with ESP. Andy was telling me at St. Luke's the other week that he listens to the podcast on random occasionally when he remembers.
There we are.
So Andy, cheers for that. Much appreciated. Hope the new baby isn't keeping you awake too much. Let me know when you hear this, if you ever do.
Indeed. I'd like to give a shout out to Scott Rubens, who emailed us recently. Scott said, I really enjoy your podcasts. I grew up with these comics.
Excellent.
I only wish more of these books were on the DC app. Yeah, us too, Scott, us too. At any rate, kudos to you and the staff for noticing the publication discrepancies.
The staff? That's me.
Yes, the book was sitting on the shelf for about 9 months, along with this book, the last issues of Lois Lane, Jimmy Olsen, and Weird Worlds. Press, I believe, was already cancelled. The reason, a paper shortage at the time of publication. All titles were scheduled for cancellation. With the paper shortage, DC officials felt it was not worth the cost of publishing the low-selling books. When the paper shortage abated, the books were published since they were ready to go.
Interesting.
Another example of late publication. For many decades, the Joker 9 remained the final issue of the series. However, in 2019, the previously unreleased 10th issue was published in collected editions and for digital purchase.
So it was, that's right. Yeah, I had an almost full set of the Joker at one point. And we are planning to do one issue of the Joker series.
Yes.
Despite the fact that it kind of doesn't feature the character that's kind of in it.
Or does it?
But it might lead us to do another portmanteau episode.
Stay tuned.
We'll have to wait and see. It's not too far away, that one, actually. We'll certainly get to it within the next year. Scott, thank you so much for your email. We really enjoyed putting the Prez episode together. It was one of our absolute favourites, so
yes.
We're really glad that you enjoyed it.
And thank you to Mark Russell for joining us again on the Prez episode.
Yes. X Factor's new writer was on the Earth 2 podcast. Put that in your pipe and smoke it.
Batman the Dark Ages writer was on the Earth 2 podcast. There we are.
Yeah, that too.
Eisner winning Mark Russell.
Yeah, God, we had an Eisner winning writer voicing a TV. Wow, how are we going to top that? Anyway, right, gosh, we've rambled a bit there, but yeah, that was great. Listeners, write in, let us know if you have any information on or further context to any of the comics that we're talking about that we haven't picked up. Or, it's all part of life's rich tapestry, and we appreciate your input. We appreciate you listening. Yeah.
On that bombshell, I've been Peter.
I've been David. Thank you for listening once again. We'll see you soon on
the Earth 2 podcast.
Transmatter cube activated. Return coordinates set for Earth Prime.
Good God, what's that?
And the host of the party, who's sat down, gestures towards him and says, "Oh, that's Max. He's one of the co-hosts on the Weird Warriors podcast."
And he's tied up right outside.
The desire to act. A long shot, but Dr.
Sorry. But Dr. Sorry, I'm on your side, of course I am.